The rain was already lashing sideways when I heard it, the muffled rhythm of hooves cutting through the wind. Out past the barn, 7 shapes emerged from the gray wash of the storm horses, blowing steam into the cold air. They rode tight, too close for strangers, their hats pulled low against the downpour. By the time they reached my porch, the lead rider swung down in a single smooth motion, her auburn hair plastered to her face. She called out over the wind, asking for shelter, her voice carrying more command than pleading. I hadn't decided whether to answer when the others began leading their horses toward my barn without a word. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever faced a moment where opening your door could change everything. My name's Silas Whitmore. I was born in a clapboard house my father built with his own hands out on a stretch of prairie where the horizon was the only boundary. My folks taught me the worth of work before I could read rising, before first light to tend stock hauling water from the creek when the well froze and breaking my back every summer to put up enough hay to last the winter. We weren't rich, but we had what we needed, and we lived by rules that didn't require much explaining. Keep your word, mind your neighbor's fence, and honor the Sabbath, unless a man's life depended on your work that day. Folks looked out for each other in those parts, not because they were saints, but because the land punished those who tried to stand alone. When I was young, I thought that kind of world would last. But the railroad brought more than goods. It brought speculators with deep pockets and colder hearts. Towns grew fast and loud, filling with folks who valued money over neighborly duty. I'd ridden for the law back then, thinking justice was a simple matter of right and wrong. It didn't take long to learn that justice had a price, and the men with the most dollars decided how it was served. I'd seen honest families lose everything to crooked deeds signed in polished offices, while the law I worked for turned its head. After Silver Creek, I walked away from that life. Bought this spread far from any town raised cattle kept to myself. For 8 years, my door stayed closed to the world. That night, with the storm tearing at the walls and 7 women waiting outside, I felt the weight of every mile I'd put between myself and other people. I told myself it was the weather that made me reach for the latch. But as my hand closed on the handle, I knew better. Some choices once made don't get taken back. And whatever waited on the other side of that door, my quiet years were about to end. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and sodden hay as I pulled the door open. Rain streaked in past the threshold, drumming on the boards. Magnolia Voss stood just beyond water sliding from the brim of her hat, her green eyes fixed on me like she was already measuring what kind of man I might be. Behind her, the other 6 women were leading their horses toward my barn without being told. I could see the animals' flanks heaving foam at their mouths, tacked too fine for folks caught out in a storm by chance. Magnolia stepped inside before I could say a word, the floorboards groaning under the weight of her boots. She pulled back her slick coat, revealing a traveling dress whose stitching hadn't come from any dry goods store within 100 miles. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, voice steady but without the warmth a body might expect from someone asking for shelter. One by one, the others followed Pearl Jensen, pale and quiet eyes always moving. Clara Boone, whose roughened hands told of hard work and maybe harder fights. Fay Larkin, with a smile too quick and too sharp. And Rose Malloy, the youngest, who kept close to the door as though ready to bolt. The last 2 gave only first names and polite nods, their faces half hidden beneath shadowed brims. I poured coffee into tin cups while they shed their outer layers and spread through the room. They moved in a way that wasn't accidental, never with their backs to each other, always near a clear way out. Even when they sat, their hands seemed too close to the folds of their skirts, as though each was touching something they meant to keep close. The storm rattled the shutters, but my mind was on the horses I'd glimpsed through the window, lean, fast animals built for covering miles in a hurry. Whatever story these women carried, it wasn't about heading west for a fresh start. "Where's your next stop?" I asked, handing Magnolia a cup. "California," she answered without hesitation. I have property there. My husband's passed on, same as theirs. We thought it wiser to travel together. Her words sounded right enough, but there was something in her tone smooth, practiced the way someone repeats a line they've told before. Across the room, Clara was looking over my curtains like she was deciding whether the cloth was worth taking, while Faye's gaze wandered across the mantel, pausing on the rifle above the hearth. We've been riding for days, Pearl said softly, wrapping both hands around her coffee. Haven't seen another soul for miles. That was a lie, and I knew it. Late that afternoon, I'd spotted dust far out along the ridge, the kind raised by more riders than a small group of women could make alone. I didn't know yet who was chasing them, but I was certain someone was. The thunder rolled closer, the windows shivering in their frames. Magnolia drifted toward the glass, peering out at the darkness beyond. Her shoulders stayed tight not from the cold, but from something more dangerous. She was watching for what might come out of that night. Behind her, Rose rose from her chair with trembling hands. I can't do this anymore, she whispered, voice barely carrying over the storm. Every head turned. Magnolia's voice was sharp as she said, Sit down, Rose. But Rose only stepped back toward the door. He's been nothing but kind, she began. Her eyes meeting mine, whatever she meant to finish was drowned out by the sound of hooves pounding into the yard. Magnolia went pale, her gaze snapping to the window. They've found us, she said under her breath. In an instant, the room came alive with movement. Derringers appeared from hidden pockets, knives from boot tops, and Faye hauled a sawed off from beneath her coat. The clink of steel was louder than the rain on the roof. I moved to the window and counted shapes emerging from the storm. 8, maybe more, spilling into the yard with the confidence of men who believed nothing could stand in their way. Their leader, a broad man in a black coat, swung down from his saddle. Even through the sheets of rain, I recognized the bearing of someone who gave orders that got men killed. His voice carried over the wind. Spread out. Check the barn. If they're here, I want them alive. Magnolia's hand found my arm, her grip fierce. They'll kill us if they find us, she said, her eyes finally stripped of all pretense. Clara's voice cut in from the corner. We took money from them, a lot of money. From where I asked, Deadwood Pearl answered. A poker game. I didn't have to ask how much to know it was enough to draw blood. The pounding on the door came next, heavy and certain. Open up, the voice outside growled. We know you're in there. The women shifted, forming a loose half circle near the hearth, their weapons ready. I kept my eyes on Magnolia, searching for whatever truth she hadn't told me yet. The next part of this night would change everything, whether I stood aside and let them face what was coming, or stepped into the storm with them. The pounding on the door came again, each blow rattling the frame. Rain and wind howled outside, but it was the voices beneath them that carried the real danger. Magnolia's eyes stayed fixed on the entrance, her grip on the pistol hidden in her skirts, tightening with each knock. We can't let them in, she said quietly, her words more for the women than for me. Faye shifted her stance, a sawed-off balanced easily in her hands. Clara moved to one side of the window, careful to keep her outline out of view. Through the glass, I could make out the leader. He was a broad-shouldered man in a long black coat hat, brim dripping, the kind of figure that seemed to fill every space he stood in. 8 others fanned out behind him, some moving toward the barn, others positioning themselves near the corners of the house. When he spoke, his voice cut through the storm. Hand them over, Whitmore. We don't need you in the middle of this. I stepped closer to the window, letting him see me. You're on my land, I called back. You've got no business here. His reply came without hesitation. They robbed the wrong man. They took what doesn't belong to them, and I aim to collect. Magnolia stepped forward, her voice carrying above the storm. What we took was already stolen. Bought with money meant for worse things than gambling. A flicker of recognition passed across his face. But it didn't slow him. "Doesn't change my job," he said, moving toward the porch. I knew his type: paid to find, paid to take, never caring what it cost anyone else. The women edged closer together, forming a rough half-circle behind me. I could hear the faint sound of someone shifting in the kitchen, the scrape of a chair leg, the subtle click of a pistol being cocked. Rose stayed near the wall, eyes darting between the door and Magnolia. "We can't fight them all," she whispered. "They'll kill us." Faye's answer was sharp. "They'll have to catch us alive first." The wind drove rain hard against the siding, the noise mixing with the horses shifting restlessly outside. I took a step back from the window, letting the edge of the curtain fall back into place. "If you've got more to tell me, now's the time," I said to Magnolia. She met my eyes, green and unflinching. "They're not after just money. That cash was payment for girls, Mr. Whitmore young ones. We took it to stop them from buying more." Her voice didn't waver, but her jaw was set tight. Clara added, "We've been running ever since, and every mile they've closed the gap." Outside, the leader's voice rose again. "Last chance. Open the door, or we come through it." I moved to the hearth, the floorboards familiar under my boots. The loose plank came up with a quick pull, and my fingers closed around steel and oiled wood. Magnolia's gaze followed the motion, her expression changing as the contents of the hidden space came into view. "You're not just a rancher," she said. "Never said I was," I replied, checking the load on the rifle. The first blow hit the door, sending splinters inward. Magnolia and Faye shifted their aim toward the entrance, while Clara kept watch on the back windows. Pearl knelt beside Rose, whispering something that made the younger woman nod. The second strike cracked the wood across its grain. I leveled the rifle, the stock firm against my shoulder. "Stay low," I told them, just as the third hit sent the door crashing open. The man in the black coat stepped in first, rainwater glistening on the barrel of his revolver. His eyes locked on me, and a slow, grim smile spread across his face. "Knew you wouldn't hand them over," he said. Always did have a stubborn streak. He raised his gun, but I was faster. The shot was loud in the small room, the recoil familiar. He staggered back, clutching his shoulder, and the fight began in earnest. Shouts filled the house boots, pounding across the porch. Faye fired twice, dropping one man in the doorway. Clara's revolver barked from the shadows, sending another to the floorboards. Pearl dragged Rose toward the pantry, keeping her head down, as lead tore through the air. Outside, the rest of them closed in their shapes, moving past the windows, rifles and shotguns in hand. I fired again, the lever on the rifle smooth in my grasp. Magnolia took the opening, putting a bullet clean through the man who'd been trying to force his way past the threshold. The storm outside roared, the smell of gunpowder already thick in the air. Every second felt stretched thin, every movement sharp as a blade. We were holding, but for how long I didn't know. From somewhere near the back of the house came the sound of glass breaking. Clara moved to cover it, her boots sliding slightly on the wet boards. Magnolia glanced toward me, her expression grim. "They'll try the sides next," she said. I nodded, once reloading with practiced hands. Outside, more boots hit the porch, and I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fight pressed in from all sides, boots pounding over the porch and the crash of glass from the rear window. Clara took that side, slipping into the darkened kitchen with her revolver drawn, the lantern light catching the sharp lines of her jaw. Faye fired again from the hearth, her shots tight and deliberate, each one finding a mark before she ducked back from the doorway. Magnolia moved between the front window and the side wall, her gaze sharp as she tracked the shapes outside. I reloaded with practiced hands, the smooth click of the lever steady against the chaos. "They're trying to push us from both ends," I called to Clara. She answered with a single shot that sent one man tumbling backward into the mud. Rose stayed low behind the table. Pearl crouched beside her with the derringer ready, the younger woman's breathing fast, but her eyes fixed on the door. The man in the black coat, Cormac Doolan, pulled himself up on the porch rail, blood darkening the sleeve where my bullet had torn through. "You're making this worse, Whitmore," he shouted. "You know what they are." Magnolia stepped forward, voice steady. "And you know what you work for." That money was blood, money Cormac, payment for girls your employers meant to sell. The words carried over the storm, drawing a brief stillness from the men outside. One at the edge of the porch hesitated, his rifle lowering an inch before Cormac's glare snapped him back in line. "Don't matter to me," Cormac said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "I was paid to bring them in, and that's what I'll do." A figure broke from the shadows along the barn, making for the back door. Clara saw him first, her shot catching the wall just inches from his head, forcing him back into cover. Faye swung to the window, covering the gap until Clara could reload. I took position beside Magnolia, covering the doorway as another rush came. Two men tried to push through, one with a knife and the other with a short-barreled shotgun. My rifle barked once, and Magnolia's pistol followed both men, collapsing before they crossed the threshold. Rainwater pooled on the boards near the door, running in thin lines toward the hearth. The smell of powder and wet wood filled the room. Outside, I could hear the restless stamping of horses and the low murmur of voices, men deciding whether to press the fight or fall back. Cormac's voice cut through. "You've got a choice, Whitmore. Step aside or we take you down with them." I kept my rifle leveled. "You've already stepped onto my land, broken into my home, and spilled blood here. You don't get to bargain now." Magnolia's eyes stayed on Cormac, searching his face for any sign he might break. Instead, he signaled to the men at the edges. The pressure at the walls eased the footsteps, pulling back into the yard. Through the front window, I watched them regroup under the slanting rain. Their shapes blurred by the storm, but their intent was clear. They weren't leaving, just shifting to another approach. Magnolia turned to me. "They'll wait us out if they have to." I nodded, feeling the weight of what came next. We gathered near the hearth, Faye wiping rain from her forehead, Clara checking the rounds left in her cylinder. Pearl poured a small measure of coffee for Rose, her hands steady despite the tension. "We can't hold forever," Clara said. "If they bring more, we'll be pinned." Magnolia met her gaze, her voice low. "Then we finish this before they can." The wind rattled the shutters, the fire popping in the grate. Outside, a single rider moved toward the edge of the yard, his outline barely visible in the gray downpour. He paused there, head turned toward the house, then wheeled his horse and rode off into the storm. None of us spoke, but we all knew whoever he was going to fetch would decide how this night ended. The rain eased enough to hear the creak of saddle leather outside, the men shifting position in the yard. The rider who had broken off in the storm hadn't returned yet, but I didn't count that as a blessing. Magnolia watched me as I slid a fresh round into the chamber. "They won't quit," she said. "They've chased us across 2 territories. They'll burn this place down if it gets them what they want." Pearl rose from her crouch, her eyes steady now. "We didn't just take money, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice low enough that the others leaned in to hear. "We took what they were going to use to buy girls, young ones, barely more than children. We couldn't let it happen again." Clara nodded, adding, "It's not the first time they've done it. We've been tracking them for months, waiting for a chance." Outside, the black-coated leader called again, his voice carrying across the yard. "Hand them over, Whitmore. You're protecting thieves." I stepped toward the open doorway, my rifle at my side. "Maybe so," I answered, "but I've seen worse men than thieves in my time." His gaze narrowed. "You think you can hold off all of us? You won't last." Magnolia took a single step past me, her green eyes locked on Cormac. "We took from men who buy and sell human lives," she said, her voice cutting through the damp air. "You work for them. That makes you part of it." A few of the men shifted at her words, though none lowered their weapons. Cormac's face darkened, but he didn't deny it. "Doesn't matter," he said. "A job's a job, and you're in the way." His hand dropped toward his revolver, but I had mine up before he cleared the holster. "You're right," I said. "I am in the way." The crack of the shot echoed under the porch roof, and Cormac staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The yard erupted. Magnolia's derringer spoke twice. Faye fired from the window, and Clara's revolver barked from the kitchen door. I worked the rifle lever by instinct, each shot aimed to keep the porch clear. Pearl stayed low with Rose behind the table, watching for any man who might try to slip past. A figure lunged from the side, making for the front entrance with a knife in his hand. Magnolia turned and dropped him with a single shot to the leg, then kicked his weapon away before he hit the boards. "Stay down," she warned, her voice like steel. The gunfire slowed, replaced by the shouts of men pulling back toward the yard. The rain had picked up again, turning the ground outside into sucking mud. I watched from the doorway as the last of them retreated to the cover of the barn, leaving two of their own sprawled in the dirt. Inside, the room smelled of smoke and wet wool. Magnolia checked her pistol and met my eye. "That rider's bringing more," she said. "We can't wait here for them." I looked around the room, 7 women armed and determined, but still outnumbered. "If you've got a plan," I told her, "now's the time to share it." She glanced at Clara, then back to me. "We make our stand here, but on our terms. They think they can wait us out. We'll show them they can't." Faye grinned, the expression fierce under the lamplight. I liked the sound of that. We moved quickly. Clara and Pearl shifted furniture to block the back door, while Magnolia and Faye reloaded near the hearth. I set fresh rounds within reach and checked the sight on my rifle. The wind rattled the shutters, and the sound of hooves in the distance told me the next wave wasn't far off. When we were ready, Magnolia gave a small nod. "They want to fight," she said. "Let's give them one." The lamplight flickered over the steel in our hands, and the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the curtain of rain, the sound of horses grew louder. The sound of hooves carried through the rain before the shapes emerged, more riders, just as Magnolia predicted. They came in from the ridgeline, circling wide toward the barn, their silhouettes black against the gray wash of the storm. Cormac's men in the yard straightened at the sight, some calling out to the newcomers. Magnolia's jaw tightened. "That's who the rider went to fetch," she said. Faye checked her shotgun, her eyes narrowing. "Then we finish this before they surround us." I moved to the front window and studied the approach. These men rode in formation, no hesitation in their pace. They weren't here to talk. I turned back to the women. "We'll hold them at the porch. No one steps inside." Clara slipped to the kitchen door, peering through the rain-streaked glass. "2 heading for the back," she said. "I can handle them." Magnolia gave a quick nod. "Do it." The first of the newcomers reached the porch at a trot, swinging down before his boots hit the boards. His hand went straight to the revolver at his hip, but I had the rifle on him before he cleared the holster. "Don't," I said. He froze, but another man came in from the side, trying to take the step in one rush. Faye's shotgun roared, sending him tumbling backward into the mud. Gunfire cracked from the kitchen, Clara's shots clean and measured. Pearl knelt beside the table, reloading her derringer, her hands steady now. Rose stayed low, eyes fixed on the front as though willing herself not to flinch. The smell of powder thickened in the room, mixing with the damp air blowing in from the open doorway. Cormac's voice rose above the gunfire. "You think you're protecting them, Whitmore? Ask them what they've done. Ask them why half the territories want them dead." Magnolia stepped into the open space beside me, her words cutting across the yard. "We've taken from men like you, Cormac, men who buy girls the way others buy cattle. You can call us thieves, but we're the only ones who've stood in your way." Some of his men faltered at that, their eyes darting toward one another. Cormac's face hardened. "You talk too much," he said, and motioned for the rest to push forward. The porch shuddered under their weight as they came in hard. I worked the lever on the rifle and fired Magnolia's pistol flashing beside me. Faye caught one in the shoulder before he reached the steps. Clara's voice called from the back, "Clear here," before another shot rang out. The fight turned close, then the distance closing to a few feet. One man lunged for the doorway, his knife glinting in the lamplight. Pearl's shot caught him square in the chest, dropping him across the threshold. Another tried to use the moment to grab Rose, but she wrenched free, shoving him hard enough for me to put him down before he could recover. Rainwater pooled across the boards, tracking in from boots and bodies. The noise was a mix of shouting gunfire and the pounding of hooves as horses spooked at the chaos. Then, as sudden as it had started, the push faltered. The surviving men backed off, dragging their wounded retreating toward the yard where the rest of their horses waited. Cormac stood just beyond the reach of the porch light, his coat plastered to him, blood still darkening the sleeve from our first exchange. "You've made your choice, Whitmore," he called, "and it's going to cost you." Magnolia stepped forward, her voice cold. "We've already paid. Question is, how much are you ready to lose?" The yard went quiet except for the hiss of the rain. The men mounted up slowly, their eyes still on the house. When they pulled back toward the ridge, I knew it wasn't over. They weren't leaving for good, just long enough to come back with whatever they thought would tip the balance. Inside, the women began gathering spent shells and checking weapons. Magnolia's gaze met mine. "They'll return," she said. "And when they do, we finish this." I nodded once the weight of her words settling in. Outside, the storm was already beginning to shift the wind, carrying a new edge that promised more trouble on the horizon. Cormac's men came back just before first light, the storm still hanging low over the plains. They spread in a half circle, their horses restless in the wet grass, steam rising from their flanks. The black coat he wore before was gone, replaced by a shorter trail coat, the kind a man could move fast in. His arm was still bound from the bullet I'd put there, but he held the reins one-handed, like it didn't trouble him. Magnolia stood at the window, her green eyes tracking every shift in the yard. "They've got fewer men than before," she said. "But they've tightened their line." Faye checked the load on her shotgun and glanced at me. "Means they're planning to push hard and fast." Clara from the kitchen door called two on the back, keeping close to the wall. I moved to the hearth and reached under the plank for the long case I hadn't opened in years. The hinges creaked as I drew it out, and Magnolia's gaze fixed on the badge tucked into the lining. "You're a lawman," she said quietly. "Federal," I answered, snapping the rifle's breech shut. "Been chasing this network for 8 years, gathering every name, every route. Tonight it ends." Cormac dismounted slow, his boots sinking into the mud. "All this for a handful of thieves," he called. "You've thrown your lot in with killers." Magnolia stepped to the porch, her voice steady. "We've killed men who would have sold children. You can call it what you like, Cormac. We call it stopping evil." He laughed once without humor. "Same difference in my book." Then his hand flicked up and the yard exploded in motion. Shots cracked from both sides, glass shattering in the kitchen as Clara answered back. Faye's shotgun boomed from the window, splintering the porch rail and sending one man sprawling. Pearl's Derringer barked twice before she ducked down to reload. I took the front line, my rifle steady, each pull of the trigger deliberate. Cormac's men closed the gap boots, hitting the porch steps, but Magnolia was there, her aim quick and sure. One dropped his revolver and staggered back into the rain. At the rear, Clara shouted, "Clear," just as another figure tried to vault the kitchen sill. Her shot put him flat before his boots touched the floor. A sudden shout cut through the gunfire. One of Cormac's men had Rose in his grip, a knife pressed to her throat. "Drop your guns or she's gone," he yelled. My eyes caught the mark burned into his wrist, barely visible under the wet cuff, a brand I'd seen before. on the bodies in Silver Creek. Magnolia saw it too. That's their buyer's mark, she called, her voice sharp. You know what he is, Whitmore? I lowered my rifle slow, meeting the man's eyes. Let her go, and you live long enough to talk to a federal judge. He sneered. You're bluffing. I reached into my coat and showed the badge. Try me. His grip faltered and Rose twisted, driving her elbow into his ribs. He stumbled, and Faye's shot took him before he could recover. Rose dropped to her knees, breathing hard but unhurt. The yard was chaos now. Two of Cormac's men lay in the mud. Another crawled toward the fence line, clutching his side. Cormac himself was still standing, his revolver raised, but his eyes were on the badge in my hand. 8 years, he said. You've been playing this game 8 years. I stepped forward, the rain dripping from my hat brim. Not a game, a case, and you just helped close it. For the first time that night, he looked unsure. But it didn't slow his hand when he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide and my rifle answered. He staggered, dropping to one knee, the mud sucking at his boots. You think this ends it? He asked, his voice rough. I know it does, I said. The marshals are moving on every safe house in 3 territories. By sundown, your buyers will be gone. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't answer. Behind him, the last of his men threw down their weapons, the fight draining from them in the cold rain. Inside, the women lowered their guns, the silence broken only by the hiss of water on the porch boards. Magnolia's gaze stayed on me. It's done, she asked. I nodded once. For them, it is. Outside, the dawn was pushing against the storm clouds, the sky lightening over the ridge. But I knew part of the night still had to be reckoned with before we could stand down. The rain slowed to a mist as the last of Cormac's men were taken into custody. The yard was heavy with the smell of wet earth and gunpowder. The porch boards slick under my boots. Federal riders moved among the wounded, securing weapons, gathering papers from saddlebags, and loading prisoners onto wagons bound for the nearest holding cell. Magnolia stood just inside the doorway, her coat still damp, watching every movement in the yard. Pearl was at the table with Rose, helping her bind a cut on her arm. Clara and Faye spoke in low voices near the hearth, their eyes still alert despite the quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from peace, more the pause after a storm when you wait to see what's been left standing. A tall marshal named Williams approached, his badge glinting in the weak light. Your signal brought us in time, he said. Every safe house we hit this morning was emptying fast, but we've got what we need. They'll stand trial in the territories they bled. I nodded, then looked toward the women. And them, Williams followed my gaze. We can place them under federal protection. New names, new towns, a clean start. Magnolia met my eyes. Together, she asked. Williams shook his head. Separate is safer. Too many folks know your faces now. She absorbed that in silence, then gave a small nod. If it keeps the others alive, we'll manage. Rose came to stand beside me, her voice quiet. What happens to the money? I told her. It would be held as evidence for now. She hesitated, then said, when it's released, send it where it can keep other girls safe. Somewhere far from here. I promised her it would be done. By mid-morning, their horses were saddled. Each woman carried only what she could pack into a small bundle. There was no ceremony in the goodbyes, just handshakes, brief embraces, and the unspoken understanding that survival meant leaving certain things behind. Faye swung into her saddle first, giving me a crooked grin. Clara tipped her hat. Pearl whispered something to Rose, who nodded once before riding out. Magnolia was the last. She reined in at the edge of the yard, the light catching her auburn hair. You could have handed us over, she said. Why didn't you? I rested my hand on the porch rail. Because some fights are worth choosing. She studied me for a heartbeat longer, then turned her horse toward the open plains. When they were gone, the yard felt too still. The blood on the porch would wash away in the next rain. but the memory of this night would stay. 8 years of watching and waiting had come to an end, not with a courtroom verdict, but with the simple fact that the guilty would harm no one else. I stood there a while longer, the sun breaking through the last ragged clouds, thinking about how quickly strangers could become allies and how justice sometimes rode in unexpected company. Out here, a man learned that peace wasn't something you found by hiding. It was something you made one hard choice at a time. If you've ever stood at a crossroads and chosen the harder trail because it was right. You know, the kind of peace, I mean.